January 1943. Guadalcanal's air runs hot with salt and avgas as a captured Mitsubishi G4M Betty is towed into the clearing light of Henderson Field, its olive drab skin scarred, its long wings flexing with each bump of the coral strip. American pilots close in, sleeves rolled, notebooks out, eyes moving along panel seams that feel too thin, too clean, too light for a bomber that could reach so far over open ocean. A crew chief raps the wing with his knuckles and listens for the hollow note. Someone traces the outline of a tank bay through a maintenance panel and frowns. There is no rubber lining, no armor plate, no protective baffles in the places they expect them to be. Just thin aluminum, fuel lines in view, and space where self-sealing should be. The Betty's reputation precedes it. Fast, long-legged, deadly at night. But the smell lingering here is of burned lacquer and singed fuel. The calling card of an airplane that lights up when hit. The Americans trade glances. How did it fly this far with so little margin for life? The answer lies in range, doctrine, and a war fought across water. And it will shape how both sides fight from this island onward. Shall I begin writing the context and background? In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued requirements for a new land-based attack bomber to replace the G4M, prioritizing unprecedented range, speed, and payload for maritime strike across the vast Pacific Arc. The result would be Mitsubishi's G4M, later codenamed Betty by the Allies, and it would embody a doctrine that treated fuel and distance as weapons in themselves. The prototype flew on October 23, 1939, demonstrating the Navy's vision was achievable. A sleek, lightweight airframe powered by twin Kase radials, capable of more than 3,400 miles of range, enough to threaten ships and bases far from Japanese airfields and carriers, and enough to alter strategic calculations in early 1942. To achieve that reach, designers minimized drag and weight at every turn, cutting into structural redundancies, armor, and, crucially, omitting full self-sealing fuel tanks in early production. A deliberate trade-off, embraced under operational doctrine that expected speed, range, formation fire, and mission profile to compensate for vulnerability. This doctrine appeared vindicated in the early campaigns. When Betty units ranged far and struck hard, they participated in the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off Malaya in December 1941, showcasing long-range torpedo attack power without carrier cover and feeding Allied perceptions of an unexpectedly far-ranging Japanese bomber force. The same aircraft carried Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, when U.S. Army Air Force's P-38s, guided by intelligence and flying a precision intercept, shot down his G4M, illustrating both the platform's strategic role and the mortal risk of relying on speed and reach over protection, once enemy air superiority sharpened. By mid-1942 through 1943, the Solomons and Guadalcanal became proving grounds for this engineering philosophy. Allied pilots learned the Betty's nickname, Flying Lighter, as hits near wing tanks or fuel lines produced sudden flame fronts, and field reports repeatedly described fierce fires from otherwise modest damage. American ground crews and pilots examining captured or forced landing Betties in the South Pacific noticed what their combat encounters had already suggested. The wing and fuselage fuel bays lacked the robust, layered rubber and treated fabric of U.S. self-sealing systems that could swell and close around punctures, and internal protective measures were limited compared to contemporary Allied bombers and even many fighters. U.S. technical literature and wartime engineering accounts emphasize that self-sealing imposed real penalties: weight, volume loss, and range reduction. Penalties the Japanese had consciously avoided in early variants to meet Navy range doctrine across oceanic distances, where striking first at long range was the perceived survival mechanism. The Japanese did experiment with partial fixes, CO2 inerting and rubber sheeting on some surfaces, as the war advanced, but these incremental measures rarely altered the defining vulnerability in the G4M1 and many G4M2 subtypes during the heaviest fighting of 1942–43. Mitsubishi's iterative improvements reflected the cost of that early calculus. The G4M2 introduced aerodynamic refinements, more powerful engines and increased fuel capacity, but still struggled to balance protection with performance as attrition mounted under stronger Allied fighter cover and flak densities in the Solomons and New Guinea theaters. Only with the late-war G4M3 did Japanese industry commit to true self-sealing tanks and added armor, accepting reduced fuel capacity and performance to improve survivability, an acknowledgement, by 1944-45, that the strategic environment now favored aircraft that could absorb damage as well as strike far. Yet production realities and timing meant only about 60 G4M3s were built, too few and too late to reverse the attrition that had defined the type's reputation after Guadalcanal and Rabaul, when U.S. and Allied pilots had already tailored tactics to exploit its fuel vulnerability. Behind these design decisions lay a wartime industrial and doctrinal story. Japan's naval air arms sought to offset treaty-era naval limitations and vast geography with land-based aviation reach, and the G4M became the expression of a strategy betting on distance and concentration of force rather than armored resilience. That meant crews flew long missions over open ocean, often without heavy escort or redundant protection, trusting in speed, altitude, and formation discipline against increasingly adept Allied interceptors equipped with radios, radar direction, and long-range fighters like the P-38, F-4F, and later F-6F and F-4U. In that crucible, ground examinations of captured Bettys didn't surprise the pilots who had seen them burn. They explained it, giving U.S. analysts tactile proof of a trade-off that would shape both sides' tactics for the remainder of the campaign, from the clean lines and cavernous fuel bays of the early G4M1 to the heavier, protected G4M3's shorter legs. The arc of the Betty mirrors the Pacific Air War's shift from offensive reach to defensive survival as Allied superiority closed the distance. The missing layers of rubber and fabric inside those early tanks were not an oversight, but the visible edge of a strategic choice. And once crews and engineers at forward fields ran their hands along the thin skin and open fuel runs, the question, why no self-sealing, became the doorway to understanding how Japan had intended to fight a war measured in miles of water rather than inches of armor. A logic soon to be tested again in the fires of the Solomons. Shall I begin writing the angles section next? The engineers start with measurements: wing thickness, spar spacing, fuel volume. They note the G4M's integral wing tanks and the thin gauge of skinning, optimized for weight and drag reduction over battle damage tolerance. And they write that down without adjectives, only numbers that whisper the same conclusion. Range was king, protection a distant second. They compare it to American self-sealing systems, multiple layers of vulcanized rubber and treated fabric that swell around punctures, accepting the weight penalty that the U.S. and British bomber doctrine had already budgeted into design and logistics, because survivability mattered more than an extra 100 miles of endurance. The Betty's Kasse engines gave speed and reach, but the spaces between frames carried fuel like a promise and a risk. And the test notes describe it clinically, the way physicians write about a patient they know is in danger when blood meets air. In those pages, engineering becomes biography, a sleek airframe built to cross oceans quickly, but with little margin when chased, probed, or raked by fire. And the conclusion aligns with what combat already showed. If a Betty is hit in the wing, it is frequently a race against flame. The human angle follows in quiet lines of duty, rosters and mission logs. Crews climbed aboard knowing the airplane could carry them. The tactical view tightens the lens. Over the Solomons and New Guinea, Allied controllers vectored fighters to altitude gates and kill boxes timed to intercept Betty formations on ingress and egress. When fuel loads were highest, and the aircraft were most vulnerable to ignition and loss of lift. U.S. squadrons adapted to aim at wing routes and engines, a practice that exploited the G4M's large fuel volume and limited sealing, turning brief bursts into cascading failures that air combat reports began to describe with grim regularity. Japanese units responded with night raids, low-level torpedo runs, and tighter timing with fighter escort, pushing mission profiles toward the edges where interception was harder. But these adaptations rarely changed the core vulnerability, once contact was made under daylight and radar-directed conditions. The tactical lesson hardened into doctrine. Deny the Betty a clean run-in, force it to maneuver under fire, and the very design that gave it reach would betray it under stress. From the American perspective, the captured airframes were not a mystery solved, but a hypothesis confirmed. Intelligence summaries had already noted the tendency of G4Ms to ignite after minimal damage, and maintenance crews recovering debris had found fuel-soaked fragments without the telltale layers of self-sealing material common on Allied types. The hands-on inspection gave details to the pattern: tank bay geometry, fuel line routing, venting choices that favored weight and simplicity, and the absence of armor around critical crew stations that U.S. crews had come to expect on medium bombers. Training shifted accordingly. Briefings emphasized aiming points, pursuit curves, and the psychological value of breaking formation cohesion early, because a scattered Betty group was not just vulnerable, it was suddenly alone against time and temperature. For pilots who had watched fire consume a target in seconds, the captured bombers' exposed systems were not a curiosity. They were a map of how to win the next fight. There is a moral and strategic angle too. Design is a choice, and in 1939-41, Japan chose reach because the Pacific is wide, bases are few, and surprise depends on getting there at all. The early war validated that choice with ships sunk and air bases shocked into silence. But war moves quickly, and when the opponent brings better radar control, more fighters and thicker belts of anti-aircraft fire, the margin for error collapses, and an airplane built to outrun fragility must now outlast it, a demand the early Betty could not meet without reimagining its core. The late war G4M3 finally folded protection into the design, with self-sealing tanks and armor, but production came late and in too few numbers to change the story written over Guadalcanal and Rabaul. The moral is not condemnation but recognition. Every extra mile of range had a name, and too many of those names never came home, which is why the absence inside those wings reads like a ledger, as much as an engineering note. Shall I begin writing the climax and turning point? Dawn presses low over the slot, the long corridor of water between the central Solomon Islands, where convoys thread and hunters wait. It is late October 1942, and then again January, and again April 1943, because the turning point is not one flight, but an accumulation, a pattern of interceptions that shifts the balance of air over the Solomons from hazard to certainty for any G4M that ventures by day. The Betty formations come in at altitude, straight and disciplined, carrying torpedoes or bombs toward Henderson Field and shipping off Lunga Point, and the controllers on the American side guide fighters into a geometry of contact that concentrates fire at the roots of the wings where fuel sits close to air and heat. The first passes are fast and decisive, bursts stitched into nacelles, into leading edges, into the places where unprotected tanks and lines live behind thin skin. Flames unfurl with the slipstream, and the big bomber, still swift and straight an instant before, becomes a burning fuse arcing toward the sea. Guadalcanal is the crucible. Through late 1942, the Betty's long range, the very reason it had, dominated early campaigns, forces it to fly heavy and predictable, along approaches that ground radar and coast watchers can read and transmit ahead of time. U.S. pilots in Wildcats and then in longer-legged P-38s and later F-4Us and F-6Fs adopt a simple practice. Aim for the wing roots, for engines and the bays between spars, because even a short burst there turns speed into a liability as fire races along the airflow. On the return legs, with fuel low and formations thinned, stragglers are caught again. The same vulnerability repeating itself at a lower altitude where bailout leaves little time and long water offers no favors. The combat reports pile up with similar phrases: ignited after brief burst, burned in seconds, wings separated after fire, and the reputation hardens into a tactic. The night offers some reprieve. Japanese crews switch to darkness for raids on Henderson and for torpedo runs against shipping, where radar coverage and night fighter coordination are less certain. Escorts tighten. Mission profiles change, with lower approaches designed to slip beneath early detection arcs and to compress the engagement window. Yet when contact occurs, the physics do not alter. Unsealed tanks and lightly protected lines, once punctured, make the fight a countdown to either quick suppression of the flame or a slide into catastrophe, and few crews have the tools or time to win that race in a hit bomber. The Japanese leadership presses tactics and valor to compensate: tighter formations, split timings, diversions from Rabaul. But the underlying exchange rate of range for resilience remains the invisible co-pilot in every sortie. April 18, 1943, becomes emblematic. Two Betty bombers carry Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his staff along a scheduled broadcast in formal precision, and American signals intelligence turns that precision into a trap. P-38. Lightnings fly a low, long intercept from Guadalcanal, guided to a narrow window where they rise into the path of the G4Ms over Bougainville. The escorting Zeros engage, but the bomber with the commander is hit and burns, falling into the jungle and sealing a strategic shift as stark as any naval battle. Speed and reach did not shield the Betty from a world where the enemy could be vectored to the exact minute and place of contact. The shock reverberates through the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service not only because of who was lost, but because the manner of loss confirms what crews already fear: that once found, the G4M too often becomes a torch. By mid-1943, the air over Rabaul and the approaches to the Solomons turn even less forgiving. Allied fighters push out from new fields, and radar and controllers carve the sky into zones of interception on ingress and egress routes charted by experience and wreckage. The G4M2 arrives with more power and range, its fuel capacity increased, its armament heavier, but its core calculus still similar. Weight saved in protection keeps the legs long. The attrition ledger says otherwise when flak and fighters are both present. In daylight, the Betty becomes a mission of odds, and in night, a mission of risk. Either way, crews walk to their aircraft, carrying the knowledge that a well-placed burst can turn their skill into a sequence they cannot arrest. The climax is less a single battle than a recognition. U.S. ground, crews walking the panels of a captured airframe, tracing the seams, tapping the bays, noting the absence of layered liners and the directness of the fuel plumbing. See with their hands what pilots have learned with their eyes and gun sights. The result is a doctrine loop that closes. Intercept earlier, strike at fuel-rich points, press disengaged elements during egress, and deny the Betty any clean, straight run to the target. The bomber's great gift, range, has met a system that can predict and exploit that very gift. The burning arcs above the slot write the turning point in orange scripts against the evening clouds. And by the time the last plumes fade, the idea of the G4M as a day marauder is ending, replaced by a role that concedes the sky to those who can both reach and endure. Shall I begin writing the aftermath?